You're probably wasting expensive honey without even realizing it. The reason usually is not your recipe, it's your timing. Most mead makers throw spices into primary fermentation because it feels like the obvious thing to do. Then a few months later, the mead starts tasting muddy, woody, strangely artificial, or like liquid potpourri, and they assume the spice itself ruined the batch. Drop a comment if you've ever had a batch drift into that liquid potpourri territory, because it happens far often than most mead makers admit. In reality, the spice usually was not the real problem. The timing was. There's also a hidden process involving a very specific 160 to 170 degree temperature window that most people completely miss. And that small detail is often the difference between a smooth, balanced metheglin and a batch that tastes harsh or medicinal. Spices extract quickly, especially once alcohol levels start rising during fermentation. At the same time, carbon dioxide moving through the must strips away volatile aromatics. Those bubbles hitting the airlock are literally carrying away some of the most delicate vanilla and spice character you paid good money for. If your goal is a smooth vanilla cinnamon metheglin with a warm finish and a strong honey character, you should focus on building the base mead first instead of trying to build the spice profile during active fermentation. Spice will not rescue a weak mead. Spice meads amplify flaws instead of hiding them. The easiest way to think about this process is with one simple rule: base first, spice last. For a dessert-style metheglin, a gravity around 1120 gives the mead enough structure so cinnamon tastes warm and layered instead of thin and sharp later. If a mead finishes around 1020, the residual sweetness softens the spice instead of letting it turn rough and woody. When a spice mead finishes too dry, cinnamon can become aggressive, while clove dominates the finish. If a mead finishes overly sweet without enough structure underneath, the profile could feel heavy and dull instead of polished and layered. The goal is a base mead that already tastes rich and balanced before a single spice touches it. The biggest improvement most mead makers can make is simply waiting until fermentation is completely finished before adding spice. Once fermentation is done, the mead is stabilized enough that you can finally taste what is actually there instead of guessing what the final flavor might become. Unfortunately, this is also where a lot of mead makers ruin another batch. They finally wait until secondary, then dump raw cinnamon sticks directly into the mead and overshoot the balance anyway. Do not dump spices into the fermenter. Infuse them instead. For a 5-gallon batch, start with 3 cinnamon sticks and 1 split vanilla bean. Place them into a sanitized container and pour about 2 cups of hot water over them at roughly 160 to 170 degrees Fahrenheit. That temperature range is important because it encourages extraction without fully boiling the spices or driving off delicate volatile oils. Let that mixture steep for about 10 to 15 minutes before cooling the infusion. Alcohol can turn a cinnamon stick into a bitter piece of wood in about 48 hours, while this hot water infusion captures the sweeter aromatics you actually want in roughly 10 minutes. Once the infusion cools, add it to the finished mead instead of the actively fermenting mead. This allows you to adjust the flavor gradually and stop once the balance finally lands where you want it. Some mead makers prefer tinctures made with vodka or another neutral spirit because they allow extremely precise dosing. The advantage is not that tinctures are automatically better. The advantage is that post-fermentation additions let you elevate the finished flavor in real time. If this infusion method just saved your next batch, let me know which spice has caused you the most trouble, because cinnamon and clove flatten more metheglins than most people realize. Unfortunately, some mead makers fix the spice additions perfectly and still bury the entire profile under the wrong fermentation character. Some yeast strains produce heavier fermentation character that can completely overpower delicate spice profiles. Cleaner strains like QA23 and US05 usually keep cinnamon and vanilla in focus instead of burying them under aggressive yeast characters. T47 can build a beautiful body for dessert-style metheglins, but warmer fermentation temperatures can make alcohol heat painfully obvious once spice enters the picture. If fruit is a part of the spice profile, 71B often works well because it softens the transition between fruit and spice. Lutrica V can also work extremely well when fermentation temperatures are less predictable because it tends to ferment cleanly across broader temperature ranges. The goal is not finding one magical yeast strain. The goal is choosing a yeast that supports the honey and spice character instead of competing with them. And this is the silent killer that ruins some otherwise beautiful metheglins. Spice mead amplifies flaws instead of hiding them, which means chlorine and chloramine become painfully obvious once cinnamon, clove, and vanilla enter the picture. That is why some metheglins still end up tasting flat, chemical, plasticky, or strangely hollow if the spice additions themselves were technically correct. Filtered or reverse osmosis water is often a much safer choice when you are building delicate spice profiles. Some mead makers also finally get the sweetness and the spice balance right, only to restart fermentation in the bottle and throw the entire profile out of alignment weeks later. If you plan to leave residual sugar in the mead or back sweeten after fermentation, stabilization becomes extremely important. Potassium sorbate and metabisulfite are commonly used to help stabilize mead and reduce the risk of renewed fermentation by inhibiting yeast reproduction. Without stabilization, fermentation can restart in the bottle, shift the flavor balance completely out of alignment, and potentially create dangerous pressure buildup over time. The frustrating part is that many of these batches were actually ruined by the spice themselves. Most of the damage happened earlier, when the mead never had the structure, extraction balance, fermentation character, or process discipline needed to let the honey and the spice work together properly. If you stop treating spice like fruit and start controlling extraction and fermentation character more carefully, you will dramatically improve your metheglins and waste far less honey in the process. Anyway, if this video helped you, please give a like and subscribe. And for more great information about mead making, click some of my other videos or playlists over here. Happy mead making.